Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in Vicksburg, Mississippi's history. Please leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We want to know where these written accounts go and what times of day or night they reach. On that wet October morning in 1854, the wagon wheels left deep tracks in the mud as they rolled toward the Russo plantation. The property was located 8 miles east of Vicksburg, Mississippi, in a valley between rolling hills that eventually led to the Mississippi River. It had rained steadily all night, and the mist that hung over the cotton fields was so thick that it looked like a burial shroud. The wagon was led by Jeremiah Tate, the overseer. Tate had only been hired 4 months before the previous overseer left for no clear reason, according to county employment records kept by the Warren County Clerk's office. People in the area knew about the Russo plantation's strange atmosphere, but not because of anything supernatural. There is no record of things like this in history, except for the strange silence that seemed to hang over the property. Reverend Samuel Blackwood, who was the circuit preacher in the area from 1848 to 1861, wrote in his private journal that visitors often said that even the slaves worked without their usual field songs. The plantation house was a small building by Mississippi standards, especially when compared to the big mansions in Natchez, which is 30 miles to the south. The 2-story white clapboard house was built in 1838, but by 1854, it was starting to look like it needed work. The paint was peeling off the columns, and some of the shutters were crooked. The gardens that had been so carefully tended were now overgrown at the edges, as if nature was slowly taking back the land. According to the 1850 census, Abigail Russo was 34 years old and had inherited the plantation after her husband died in 1849. County records only say that Charles Russo died of fever, but local doctor Dr. James Wilkinson wrote in his private medical ledger that the symptoms had been very strange and had gotten worse very quickly. According to an article in the Vicksburg Evening Post from the 12th of August, 1961, this ledger was found while the courthouse was being remodeled. The wagon that followed Tate had things from Vicksburg that the plantation couldn't make itself, like tools, fabric, salt, and other things. Tate had made this trip 3 times before without any problems. Isaiah Johnson, a free black man, was the driver. He would later give testimony that would be very important for understanding what happened next. Tate noticed something was wrong right away as the wagon got closer to the main house. There was no noise, no slaves working in the yard, and no smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. The windows of the main house were all closed, even though it was late morning. Tate told the Warren County Sheriff later, on the 28th of October, 1854, that at first he thought that Mrs. Russo might have been sick and the staff was taking care of her. He got off his horse and walked up to the front door, calling out as he went. There was no answer. It was strange for a plantation house to have an open door, even during the day. The heavy damask curtains were drawn against the morning light, making the foyer dark. Tate later said that the smell in the air was like wet earth and old copper. Forensic experts who worked on this documentary say that this description fits with the smell of blood that has been exposed to air for a few days. Isaiah Johnson stayed with the wagon, as was the custom. He could see Tate go into the house from where he was. Time went by. Johnson later said that he had started to worry when a person showed up at an upstairs window for a second and then the curtain fell back into place. Johnson was sure it wasn't Tate, because the overseer had come in through the ground floor and didn't have enough time to go upstairs. Tate walked around the ground floor of the house, going from room to room. The parlor was quiet, but there was an abandoned tea service on a side table. The tea had long since evaporated, leaving a dark residue in the china cups. There were signs that a meal had been interrupted in the dining room. There were still 3 plates of food on the table, but they were now covered in mold. The kitchen was the scariest place. Tate found the cooking fire cold, but a pot of stew was still hanging over it, and the contents had turned into a gray mass. There were no signs of the house slaves. No bodies, no blood, no signs of a fight, just a lack of presence where there should have been. Tate later said that when he went back to the foyer to check the upstairs rooms, he heard a sound from above, a slow, dragging footstep on the wooden floor. He yelled Mrs. Russo's name. The footsteps stopped, Multiple sources, including Tate's official statement, Isaiah Johnson's testimony, and bits of a journal found hidden in the slave quarters during the investigation that followed, have helped put together what happened next. The Warren County Historical Society kept these papers in their archives until 1958, when they were sent to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson. In 1963, researchers trying to get to these records said that the files had been lost during cataloging. Tate climbed the stairs with his hand on the gun he was carrying. The hallway upstairs was dark, and all 4 bedroom doors were closed. He heard a sound like crying coming from behind one of them, but it was off in its rhythm. He walked up to Mrs. Rousseau's bedroom door and knocked. The crying stopped. He unlocked the door. Sheriff William Hargrove's official report from the 29th of October 1854 gives only the most clinical account of what Tate found. Mrs. Rousseau was in the room, alive, and sitting in a chair facing the window. There were signs that more than one person had recently slept in the bed. The report didn't say what was in the leather-bound ledger that was open on the writing desk. Isaiah Johnson would later say in a statement to a journalist from the New York Tribune in 1872, long after he had moved to Pennsylvania, that Tate came out of the house looking as pale as death and told Johnson to ride to Vicksburg right away to get the sheriff. Tate reportedly told Johnson, "There are things no man should see, and fewer still should speak of." Johnson left right away, leaving Tate alone on the plantation. About 4 hours later, Sheriff Hargrove and 3 deputies showed up and found Tate sitting on the front steps of the house with his gun in his lap. The sheriff's personal diary, which was found among his belongings after he died in 1878, says that Tate looked up as they got closer and said, "She won't let them leave. None of them. And now I fear she won't let me leave either." The sheriff and his men went into the house, leaving 1 deputy outside with Tate. The Warren County clerk sealed the report by order of Judge Everett Wilson because it was so disturbing. This sealed report was supposed to stay in the courthouse records room until 1891, when a fire destroyed most of the building's east wing. People are still not sure if the report burned or was taken away before the fire. What is certain is that Abigail Rousseau was taken off the plantation and sent to the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson after the sheriff's investigation. She stayed there until she died in 1859. The official cause of death was failure of the heart, but asylum Dr. Thomas Kirkland wrote in the medical record that the patient had not shown any signs of heart problems before, and it seemed like she was just willing herself to die. In 1855, the Rousseau plantation was sold at auction, but it wasn't lived in for almost 10 years. People in the area stayed away from the property, but no one would say why. Union soldiers took over the house in 1864, during the Civil War, and used it as a temporary field hospital. Colonel Marcus Whitman, the commanding officer, said in his official report that the men would not sleep inside the walls. Instead, they chose to sleep in tents, even though it was cold in December. Not long after, the house was set on fire, but it's not clear if Union soldiers or local residents did it. We have put together bits of information to figure out what happened to the slaves who worked on the plantation. There are only 29 people on the plantation's 1,852 inventory who are still alive today. Some were in sale documents for other plantations in the area. Some people were said to have fled north during the war's chaos. 14 just disappeared from all official records. In 1897, workers digging near the old Rousseau plantation site to build a new road between Vicksburg and Jackson found a mass grave with several sets of human remains. The Vicksburg Daily Herald from the 7th of June, 1897, says that the authorities thought the remains were probably those of slaves because of where they were found and some physical signs, like healed fractures that were consistent with hard work. The graves didn't have any markers, and the bodies were arranged in a way that one worker said looked like the spokes of a wheel, with the heads at the center. The county coroner said the burials probably happened about 40 years ago, which would have been around the time of the events at the Rousseau plantation. The coroner's report said that several of the skulls had small holes drilled into the bone, which was probably the most disturbing thing. This was not mentioned in newspaper articles. Forensic archaeologists today say that these changes don't fit with any known burial practices from that time, whether they were European or African. After giving his statement to Sheriff Hargrove, Jeremiah Tate was no longer listed in Warren County records. 3 months later, his name shows up on a ship's manifest that is leaving New Orleans for Liverpool, England. No one knows what happened to him after he got to Europe. Isaiah Johnson's story, which he told years later from the safety of Pennsylvania, may have the most disturbing details about the case. The New York Tribune published an article on the 12th of November, 1872, that said Johnson said he saw something that haunted him for the rest of his life as he was getting ready to leave for Vicksburg. He said he saw a few of the field slaves walking toward the main house. They were moving like they were asleep, with their eyes open but not seeing. Mrs. Rousseau was in charge of them, and Johnson said she was speaking to them in a language he didn't understand. Most historians didn't believe Johnson's story because it was too sensational. They pointed out that by 1872, stories about the supernatural were very popular in northern newspapers, especially those about the South before the Civil War. However, some parts of his story match up with facts found in the official investigation, which suggests that it is at least partly true. Dr. Elelena Caldwell, a history professor at the University of Mississippi, tried to look into the Rousseau case in 1927 as part of a larger study of strange legal cases in Mississippi before the Civil War. She was not allowed to see what was left of the county records. In a letter to a coworker dated the 3rd of March, 1927, Caldwell wrote, "I am met with silence or outright hostility when I mention the Rousseau name. When she asked about the plantation, an elderly gentleman at the Historical Society practically kicked her out. Whatever happened there, the people of Vicksburg still think it should stay buried." Dr. Caldwell stopped her research soon after that and took a job at Columbia University in New York. After her death in 1954, her personal papers were given to the University of Mississippi Archives. One of them has a sealed envelope with the words, "Rousseau, not for publication" on it. University officials have always refused to open this envelope, saying they are following Dr. Caldwell's wishes. A graduate student named Marcus Thompson became interested in the Rousseau case in 1961 during the Civil Rights Movement, while he was looking into the history of slave resistance in the Vicksburg area. Thompson was able to find a descendant of one of the Rousseau plantation slaves who lived in Chicago. The old lady, who asked Thompson not to use her name in his thesis, told a story that had been passed down through her family for generations. This oral history says that Abigail Rousseau was looking into what she called old ways after her husband died. She was sure that some practices from West Africa could make her slaves work harder and make sure they always obeyed her. The woman's ancestors said that Mrs. Rousseau got a book from a sailor who had been on the Guinea coast and started doing rituals in the slave quarters at night. Thompson's academic advisors told him to take this story out of his thesis because they thought it was unprovable folklore. Thompson complied but added a note to his personal research files, which are now kept by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. The note said, "The physical evidence found at the plantation site in 1897, especially the way the bodies were arranged and the changes made to the skulls, suggests that something far more systematic and deliberate than random violence happened on the Rousseau property." Richard Carter, a reporter for the Vicksburg Evening Post, wrote a series of articles about local historical mysteries in 1964. His editor wouldn't let him include the Rousseau case because there weren't enough reliable sources. Carter was angry, so he did his own investigation and found old people whose grandparents lived in the area in the 1852. One of these residents, Harold Blackwood, who was a descendant of Reverend Samuel Blackwood, told a story that had been passed down through his family. Blackwood says that his great-grandfather was called to the Rousseau plantation about a month before the events of October 1854. Mrs. Rousseau asked him to bless the property because she said unquiet spirits were keeping her up at night. The Reverend said that the slaves were in a lot of pain, but they wouldn't talk to him directly. The Reverend was most worried when he found strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood on the walls of the slave cabins. When Reverend Blackwood asked Mrs. Rousseau about these things, she is said to have said, "They belong to me, body and soul. What I do with them is between myself and God." The Reverend left the plantation and never came back. Mrs. Rousseau gave a large amount of money to his church board a week later, along with a letter asking that the Reverend circuit be changed so that her property was not included. Carter never made these results public. After he died in 1987, his notes were found among his things, along with a letter to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History saying he would not give them his research materials about the Russo case. Carter wrote in the letter, "I have come to the conclusion that some histories are best left alone. I have destroyed my interview recordings and will burn my notes before I die." The land where the Russo plantation used to be stayed empty until the 20th century. Farmers in the area stayed away from it because they said the soil was bad and wouldn't support crops. A developer bought the land in 1972 with the idea of making a subdivision out of it. During the first survey, workers said that some of the equipment wasn't working right and that there were strange cold spots. The project was canceled after the main developer died of a heart attack while walking the property line. The site is now part of a nature preserve. People who hike through the area where the main house used to be sometimes say they hear what sounds like voices in the distance. Wildlife officials say that some animals, especially birds, seem to stay away from the area even though it has a lot of good habitat. We will probably never know for sure what really happened at the Russo plantation in the days leading up to the 28th of October, 1854. The official records have either been lost, destroyed, or kept secret on purpose. The people who saw it happen are all dead now. All that is left are bits of paperwork, oral histories that may not be very reliable, and the physical evidence that was found decades later. The fact that the case was systematically erased from local history is probably the most terrifying part of it. Unlike other terrible things that happened before the Civil War, which were at least remembered even if they weren't dealt with properly, the things that happened at the Russo plantation seem to have been too horrible to remember. It seems like everyone in the community agreed without saying anything that some horrible things are too big to be a part of history. The administrator of the asylum found a sealed envelope in a vault in 1959, exactly 100 years after Abigail Russo died there. The envelope had a patient's personal items in it. There was a single page ripped out of what looked like Russo's personal journal inside. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History now has the page, which has only one readable entry. It is dated the 23rd of October, 1854, 5 days before Jeremiah Tate's discovery. "They are mine. The book shows the way. Their bodies labor in the fields, but their minds travel roads no living man was meant to walk. Through them I have glimpsed what lies beyond. Charles would be proud of what I have accomplished. Soon I will join him, and we will never be parted again." The rest of the journal, if it ever existed, has never been found. During renovations of the old asylum building in 1968, workers found a small hole in the wall of the room where Abigail Russo lived her last years. There was a small cloth doll inside that was made in a rough way from what lab tests would later show was human hair and pieces of cotton fabric. The doll's chest had 43 small pins in it, which was the same number of slaves that the Russo plantation had at the time of the events. Locally, the road that goes closest to the old plantation site is still called Whisper Road, even though there is no official map that shows it as such. People who live in the area still take the long way around instead of using this path at night. Most people just shake their heads and say, some traditions don't need explaining. The truth about what happened at the Russo plantation is still hidden, like so many other uncomfortable parts of American history. But in the silence that has grown around it, in the deliberate forgetting, we may be able to see the outlines of a horror that was too terrible for even the harshest standards of its time. That October morning, Jeremiah Tate saw something in Abigail Russo's bedroom that made him leave not only Mississippi, but the whole country. Isaiah Johnson would never forget what he saw as he left for Vicksburg. And whatever happened to those 14 missing slaves was so bad that a whole community decided to act like it never happened. It seems that some silences say a lot, and some histories, once buried, leave behind echoes that never really go away. Dr. Aim Martin Everett, a linguistics professor at Tulane University, found a mention of the Russo case while looking into Mississippi's regional dialects in 1932. His interest in school reached its peak. Everett went to Vicksburg in the hopes of finding out more. In private letters to a colleague that are now kept in Tulane's archives, he said that local officials were very uncooperative. The county clerk said that important records were lost in the courthouse fire of 1891, and the Historical Society said they didn't have any information about the Russo family. Everett didn't give up and looked for older people whose families had lived in the area for generations. Most people wouldn't talk to him once they found out he was interested in the Russo plantation. But one woman, whose name he only wrote down as Mrs. G, said she would meet him at her house outside of town. Mrs. G said that she was a descendant of a family that used to own a plantation next door. Everett's research journal says that there were rumors about Abigail Russo even before the events of 1854. After her husband died, Mrs. Russo became more and more reclusive and only went to Vicksburg when she had to. Witnesses said that when she did go out in public, she seemed different, as if she were standing next to herself. Mrs. G's claim that her grandmother had once gone to a dinner party at the Russo plantation in early 1854 was the most upsetting. During the meal, Mrs. Russo is said to have talked about her experiments with different ways of punishing her slaves that let them work longer hours without taking breaks. Mrs. Russo is said to have replied to a guest who was worried about the morality of such practices, "They have no souls to damage." And I have found a way to make use of that absence. The dinner party story was not included in any of the official records related to the case, and Everett himself was doubtful about its truthfulness in his notes. Still, he was interested enough to stay in Vicksburg longer, hoping to find other sources to back up the story. Everett stopped working on the project after 2 weeks. He wrote to his department chair at Tulane on the 18th of June, 1932, saying, "I must return to New Orleans immediately, due to a family emergency." However, there is no record of such an emergency in his personal papers, and when he got back, his coworkers said he refused to talk about his time in Vicksburg. He never published any results from his work on the Russo case, and the research materials he used for that work were missing from the academic papers he gave to Tulane after he died in 1957. As part of his master's thesis in 1948, a geology student from the University of Mississippi took soil samples from different places in Warren County. One sample, taken from the old Russo plantation site, had strange amounts of iron, salt, and an unknown organic compound. Robert Matt, the student, tried to study the compound more closely, but the sample was accidentally destroyed in a lab accident. Matt saw the strange thing in his thesis, but didn't look into it any further. His faculty advisor told him not to take more samples from the site because they were worried about trespassing on private property, even though the land was part of a public nature preserve at the time. The most exciting clue in the Russo case came to light in 1953 when renovations at the Mississippi State Archives found a storage room that had been hidden away for years and contained records that were thought to have been lost decades earlier. One of these was a thin file with the title Russo Inquest, Warren County 1854. Archivist Thomas Mitchell made a list of the files, but he said that the file only had one document in it. A partial transcription of testimony given by Dr. James Wilkinson, the doctor who had treated Charles Russo before he died in 1849. Dr. Wilkinson's testimony, which was given on the 30th of October, 1854, said that he had been called to look at the slaves on the Russo plantation after the sheriff had already looked into the matter. He wrote down his clinical observations in cold, clinical language, but the things he said were still disturbing. He wrote down that he found 29 of the plantation's 43 slaves in a state he called conscious insensibility. They could follow simple orders, but they didn't seem to be aware of their surroundings or respond to pain. Dr. Wilkinson was most worried that each of these people had a small, precise cut at the base of the skull, which he thought at first was from surgery. But after looking more closely, he decided that the wounds had not been made with any medical tool he knew of. The cuts had healed a little, which means they were probably made a few weeks before his exam. The sheriff's men searched the woods and fields around the property, but they couldn't find the other 14 slaves. Dr. Wilkinson's testimony ended with his professional opinion that whatever procedure was performed on these individuals represents a profound violation of both medical ethics and human dignity. The full transcript was never found, and by 1955, when researcher Elalana Caldwell tried to access it, the partial document itself had disappeared from the archives. Thomas Mitchell, the archivist who first organized the file, had moved to California by then and could not be reached for comment. In 1967, William Faulkner's estate was organizing his unpublished notes when researchers found a folder with material for a novel that seemed to have been abandoned. There were character sketches and plot outlines for a story set on a Mississippi plantation in the 1,850 seconds in the folder called Bondsman's Burden. The main character was supposed to be an overseer who finds out that the plantation mistress has been doing horrible things to her slaves. Faulkner's notes talk about historical research he did, like talking to old people who lived in the Vicksburg area. One note says, "Are in case facts more disturbing than any fiction, not suitable for publication." Literary scholars have argued over whether Faulkner really found out about the Rousseau case, or if the similarities were just a coincidence. Faulkner never publicly admitted to having anything to do with the real events, and the book was still not finished when he died in 1962. In 1959, cultural anthropologist Dr. Helen Morris led a team from the University of Chicago on an archaeological survey of antebellum plantation sites in Mississippi. This may have been the most scientifically sound study of the Rousseau plantation site. The team spent 3 weeks digging up the area where the Rousseau main house and slave quarters used to be, carefully recording what they found. In 1960, they published their official report in the Journal of Southern Historical Archaeology. It said that they had found the foundations of both the main house and 7 smaller buildings, which they called slave cabins. The team found a small room about 6 feet square and 4 feet deep under the floor of one cabin. At first, they thought it was clay, but later they found out it was a mix of clay, ash, salt, and organic material, including human blood. There were a number of artifacts in the chamber, including African-style ceramic pots, small bone carvings, and metal tools, whose purpose is unknown. The most important thing was finding a leather-bound book that was written in a mix of English, French, and what language experts say is a Bantu dialect from the Congo region. There were detailed drawings of the human brain and nervous system in the book, along with text that explained how to separate consciousness from will. After Morris's findings were published, the University of Chicago was pressured by unnamed sources to distance itself from the research. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History got the artifacts so they could be properly cataloged and kept safe. In 1963, when Morris tried to get them for more research, she was told that the items had been lost during a reorganization of the collection. The leather-bound book was never officially cataloged, so it basically disappeared from history. In the years after her research at the Rousseau site, Dr. Morris herself became more and more paranoid. Colleagues say that she left the University of Chicago in 1965 and went back to her family's home in Vermont, where she reportedly cut off all contact with former academic colleagues. Morris gave a rare interview to a local newspaper in 1971 and said, "There are things buried in our history that should stay buried. I made the mistake of digging one of them up." The Mississippi State Hospital, which used to be the state lunatic asylum where Abigail Rousseau was held, digitized all of its old patient records in 1978. Dr. Susan Chen, an archivist, found a set of treatment notes about Rousseau's case that were not in the official medical record during this process. Dr. Thomas Kirkland, the asylum doctor, wrote these notes about Rousseau's behavior during her 5 years of confinement in very specific terms. Dr. Kirkland said that Rousseau spent hours every day having what he called one-sided conversations, in which he spoke to people who weren't there in several languages. She drew complicated pictures on the walls of her room, and the staff painted over them many times, only to find that new pictures had appeared overnight. Kirkland was most worried when he saw that other patients who lived near Rousseau were acting the same way, such as speaking languages they shouldn't have known and drawing the same symbols on their own walls. 3 days before Rousseau's death in 1859, Kirkland wrote in his last entry, "I can no longer dismiss the possibility that Mrs. Rousseau's condition represents not mental deterioration, but mental expansion of a sort beyond conventional understanding. What she knows, or believes she knows, cannot be reconciled with natural law as currently understood. I have requested her transfer to isolation for the safety of other patients, and indeed for the safety of all who come in contact with her." Dr. Chen's discovery was documented in an internal hospital report. but was never published in any academic journal. Researchers say that the original treatment notes were sent to the state archives, but they haven't been able to find them in the years since. While working on his complete history of the Civil War in 1982, novelist and historian Shelby Foote got a package from someone he didn't know. The package had photocopies of what looked like pages from Sheriff William Hargrove's original report on the Russo case. This report is thought to have been destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1891. Foote never used this information in his published work, but in a 1995 interview with the Oxford American, he mentioned a case in Mississippi before the Civil War that was so strange that it doesn't fit into any historical category. Foote's literary executive found the photocopied pages in his research materials after he died in 2005. Historical experts have never been able to prove that they are real, and the original documents, if they exist, have never been made public. The University of Mississippi Archives received the photocopies as a gift, but they must stay sealed until 2175, 221 years after the events they describe. In 1998, workers digging for a highway expansion near the old Russo plantation site found human remains that had not been found in 1897. These remains were not arranged in any way like the ones found before. They looked like they had been buried quickly. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Tennessee looked at the remains and found that they were from 3 adults who had died about 150 years before. The most interesting thing they found was that each skull had a small, perfectly drilled hole at the base, just like Dr. Wilkinson said. Trace evidence pointed to the fact that a metal tool had been pushed through these holes into the brain tissue. The anthropologist's report said that the procedure would have killed the person. But other evidence, like the growth of bones around the drill sites, showed that the people had lived for a while after that. This find briefly sparked historians of antebellum Mississippi's interest in the Russo case again. However, mainstream academic journals were still hesitant to talk about the story directly. This could be because it had disturbing implications about how cruel people could be during slavery, or it could be because the evidence was not very clear. Rebecca Lawson, a documentary filmmaker, started looking into the Russo case in 2009 for a movie she wanted to make about the forgotten histories of the antebellum South. Even though production companies were excited at first, Lawson ran into a lot of problems. Interviewees canceled without giving a reason, and archives said that the materials needed were not available because of ongoing conservation work. Officials in Vicksburg were polite but unhelpful, sending her to the same few sources that had been known to the public for decades. After 6 months of trying and failing, Lawson gave up on the project. In a blog post that was quickly taken down but saved by internet archiving services, she wrote, "I've never seen such a coordinated resistance to historical inquiry. It's as if an invisible barrier has been erected around this particular case. The question is whether this is an institutional desire to hide a particularly shameful part of American history or something more personal, a collective agreement among those who are connected to the story that some truths are too disturbing to dig up." The old Russo plantation site is still empty today. It is inside the Vicksburg National Military Park, but it is not shown on any official maps or talked about in any park literature. Park rangers tell people not to go into the area because they are worried about unstable ground and hidden sinkholes. People in the area still stay away from the place, especially at night. Ground-penetrating radar surveys done in 2018 as part of an environmental impact study found strange things under the ground where the main house used to be. The technology showed that there was a chamber about 15 feet below the surface that was about 10 feet square. The environmental survey team suggested more research, but county officials turned down the idea because they didn't have enough money. One of the most disturbing, unsolved mysteries of antebellum America is what really happened at the Russo plantation in the fall of 1854. The incomplete evidence points to a clash of cultures, beliefs, and ways of life that led to even worse crimes than the already terrible ones that happened during slavery. Abigail Russo seems to have found or come up with ways to control her human property that were too extreme for even her peers to accept. The long-term attempts to keep information about the case secret, which have involved many institutions and generations, suggest a shared desire to forget not just out of shame for the past, but maybe also out of fear that certain knowledge, once released, cannot be contained again. Isaiah Johnson, the wagon driver who saw the start of the investigation, may have put it best in his 1872 interview. Some evils you can name, and by naming them, you can start to overcome them. But what happened at the Russo place has no name in any language I know, and maybe that's for the best. Most of the land where the plantation used to be is now covered by forests. Nature has almost completely erased any signs of the buildings where those horrible things happened. But there is still something that can't be seen, a heaviness in the air, and a silence that seems to soak up sound instead of bounce it back. Local tour guides who take groups through the Vicksburg National Military Park sometimes point to the old Russo land, but they never get close. They've never done a proper survey of that area. They tell people who ask, it's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. The whole truth may never be known. The main witnesses have been dead for more than 100 years. The documents that would have told us the most have been lost, destroyed, or hidden on purpose. There are only bits and pieces left, whispers and fragments that don't fit together to make a clear picture. Maybe that lack of completeness is a blessing. Some parts of history, when fully revealed, may be too much for the human conscience to handle. The case of Abigail Russo and the 43 people who were under her control may be one of those truths that are better left partly hidden. But it is important to remember that there are still mysteries out there, and that there are still dark spots in our historical record where full understanding has never reached. In those shadows are lessons about how far people can go with both creativity and cruelty, as well as warnings about the risks that come with one person claiming complete ownership of another. The wagon wheels that brought Jeremiah Tate to his discovery that October morning in 1854 did not leave any marks on the ground. The screams that may have echoed across the plantation in the days before did not leave any vibrations in the air. There isn't much evidence of the suffering of those 43 people in our historical record. But somewhere in old papers and buried bones, in stories and bits and pieces, in nightmares and whispered warnings, the truth of what happened at the Russo plantation is still out there. It's not a full story, but a shadow, a negative space in our understanding that shows us something deep about the history we've inherited and the duties we have to face it honestly. Photographers call the time of day when the sun sets over Vicksburg in the fall the golden hour. The rolling hills cast long shadows, and for a short time, the landscape looks both beautiful and more real. With every contour and crevice standing out, in that light, which shows everything, someone could stand at the edge of what used to be the Russo plantation and feel the weight of its unresolved history. The questions that still hang in the air, like the Mississippi mist, waiting for answers that may never come. And maybe, if you listen closely as the sun goes down, you can hear something like a whisper carried on the evening breeze. It's not words, but it's the faintest hint that some stories, no matter how deep they are buried, won't stay completely quiet.